And welcome to our first instalment of a churchyard tour from St Margaret's Churchyard in Barking. And I'm going to start you off with the oldest stone that still has a legible or readable inscription. Here lies ye body of Thomas More, who departed this life April ye 6, 1670, being then churchwarden of this parish, aged 35 years. And the verse or inscription below is actually quite interesting, so bear with me a minute while I get my other phone out and read it to you. Stay here a while, and his sad fate deplore, for here lies the body of one Thomas More. His name was More, but now it may be said, he is no more, for he is dead, and in this place doth lie sepulchred. That's Thomas More, churchwarden. And I've been able to access some of the burial records for St Margaret's Barking, and I've got Thomas More's burial entry. So we'll take a look at that now, shall we? And here we are with the burial registers from St Margaret's Church in Barking. And if you look to where the arrow is, you'll see the burial entry for Thomas More. He was buried on the 9th of April 1670, and he was buried just 3 days after his death, having died on the 6th of April 1670, which to our time and mind seems a pretty quick burial. What you have to bear in mind back in those days is most people, unless they were very wealthy, they weren't embalmed, and they certainly wouldn't have been buried in lead-lined coffins. So for obvious and unpleasant reasons, particularly if it was a mild or warm season, people had to be buried pretty quickly. And Thomas More lived for a really interesting period of English history. He would have lived to have known of the execution of King Charles I, the coming in of Oliver Cromwell and the Republic, when, particularly in country parishes, the things that they loved and enjoyed, like the celebration of Christmas, dancing round the maypole, and the performance of plays and things like that, were all banned and outlawed. And those who defied those bans and outlawings were heavily punished. He would have lived to have seen the end of that pretty dark period, the puritanical era of England, and the death of Cromwell, and would have lived to have known the coming in of a new king, King Charles II, the merry monarch, who most definitely wasn't against people having a good time and enjoying themselves, having enjoyed many himself. And if you look to above the arrow, you'll see AD 1670, and that appears on the 26th of March. And back then, in Thomas More's time, and before the 1750s, the New Year wasn't celebrated on the 1st of January as we celebrate it. In Thomas More's day, and right up until the 1750s, New Year was celebrated on the 25th of March, on Lady Day. So that's another little interesting quirk of history. And then, as now, New Year was celebrated with real gusto. Fireworks would be put on if they could be afforded, and they were around at the time. But often in country parishes you'd have the ringing of the church bells, which would sometimes be rung for many hours. And that was often done to frighten away evil spirits. Our forebears back in those days were very superstitious people. They believed in God, the devil, goblins, ghosts and fairies. So they were a superstitious lot. Another thing that would be done on New Year's night was small fires would be lit, small enough for a person to be able to jump over, and bones would be put on these fires that would create an awful stink, and people would often join hands and jump over these fires together. That was A, meant to bring them good luck, and B, was also meant to dispel once again evil spirits. And these bone fires is what gives us our modern day bonfires. That's the burial entry of Thomas More. And here in this lovely little illustration, you can see over to the right, 2 churchwardens carrying their staffs of office. Those staffs of office were literally symbols of their authority. And these are St Margaret's Barking's churchwarden staffs of office, and of course they're later than Thomas More's time, but they give us a wonderful representation of what he would have been carrying at the time. And a churchwarden's role, then and now, it was quite a responsible position, really. It wasn't just the general day-to-day running and maintenance of the church, but often they would be in charge of large sums of money, so they'd have to be trusted, because these large sums of money were often left by rich parishioners for the use of the poor, as we've seen on many of the monuments in St Margaret's Church in Barking, that people left such and such a sum to the use of the poor. And I've seen a few wills of richer people from Barking where they left money for the use of the poor, to be spent at the discretion of ye churchwardens. And this money, or dole, as it would have been called, would be handed out by the churchwardens, bread in the form of bread and money and things like that. There was no welfare state back then, so the poor often relied on the benevolence and kindness of the rich. And what you're looking at here are just some accounts of a churchwarden, so they would have had to have been literate as well. And that's just a little bit of the life of Thomas More, ye churchwarden, as it tells us on his stone. And let's go back on with our tour. Well, that's Thomas More, whose sad fate we have deplored. So, in no particular chronological or date order now with our others, before I take you to the second oldest grave with a still readable inscription. Now this one's in the process of blistering, so the top inscription's pretty much gone. All we can see of that is Goodacre, and he died in 1853. But luckily enough we can find out who he is from his wife's inscription below. Catherine, widow of the above, I know it says that from my research, widow of the above Henry Goodacre, died March the 14th, 1898, aged 98 years. She died being old and full of days. So, as that's in the process of blistering, in not too many years, you won't be able to read any of the inscription at all, unfortunately. And our next subject, in memory of Robert Henry Gosling, who died January the 27th, 1876, aged 37 years. Also, Daniel Gosling, father of the above, who died September the 27th, 1884, aged 66 years. Also Mary Jane, wife of the above Daniel Gosling, who died September the 7th, 1892, aged 74 years. Her end was peace. And with many of our gravestones and tombstones, the inscriptions have long since vanished, I'm afraid. We're walking amongst 18th century ones in this part of the churchyard. This is the window of the Lady Chapel. Here lieth ye body of Mary Pitman, late wife of Thomas Pitman, and she died on the 3rd of June 1706, aged 30 years. The ivy covered tomb there. take you to our next one. With a still readable inscription. Some of them have unfortunately been vandalised over the years, and there have been some accidents with council lawnmowers as well. So now the top part of the inscription's pretty good on this one. Sacred to the memory of James Bones, died 5th of April 1835, aged 56 years. Also Anne Bones, died 9th of April 1856, aged 84 years. Also Flora Nairn, the beloved wife of George Nairn, who died the 10th of February 1907, aged 83 years. And you've got also the above named George Nairn, and I'm afraid the rest of the inscription is pretty much gone. Now in this section that you can see here, the graves I'm looking at, pretty much most of them are Parson's family. Now, when I say Parsons, I mean their surname was Parsons, that they weren't the parsons or vicars of this church. In memory of Mrs. Anne Parsons, it could be Miss Anne Parsons, daughter of Mr. James Parsons, who departed this life the 6th of November 17, and I'm afraid the rest of the inscription's gone, aged 5 years. Now the inscription on this one at the top is completely worn away, but there are still traces of it here. Also, Mr. Henry Parsons, Miss Mary Parsons, widow of the above named Thomas Parsons, and you can see the rest of the inscription's gone. This one at the end here, although the inscription's gone completely, I know from my research, because anyone doing family research at St Margaret's Churchyard here, go to Vallance House, the archives there, and ask to look at the Monumental Inscriptions book. In the 1930s, a fellow went round and wrote down every tombstone and grave with still legible inscriptions, and even marked them out on a map. So it proved very helpful with my own family research over the years. But I know in this one is Thomas and Sarah Parsons, and Thomas died mid-18th century and his wife Sarah died latter middle 18th century. And the Parsons family, Thomas, his father and grandfather before him, and his sons and grandsons after him, they were all pork butchers over there in what was the old town of Barking. In loving memory of Elizabeth Gutteridge, daughter of William and Elizabeth Best, who died the 3rd of September 1910, aged 67 years. And this one's still got a pretty clearish inscription on it. Here lies the body of Mr. James Parson, who departed this life the 5th of November 1735, aged 60 years. So in those days, although 60 doesn't seem particularly old to us nowadays, it's a pretty good age for back in an era before antibiotics and antiseptics, and something for this family, particularly considering their trade of pork butchery, something as simple as a cut finger could, if it got infected, carry you off quite easily. Here lies ye body of Thomas Parsons, who died August, and I think it's the 17th, 1751, and it's aged 80 years, so that's a very good age for someone from that era. As I say, we're in no particular chronological or date order. Our graves here, I just show you them as I find them. And this one's quite an unusual thing really, because these cast iron railings, you often see the apertures or openings in these where they've been cut away, and a lot of them were taken away in the war to melt down for the war effort, so this is quite unusual to still retain its ones. Sacred to the memory of Mr. Hugh Belts, Bellts, late of this parish, who departed this life May the 19th, 1840, and it's either 48 or 40, aged 57 years. Also, sorry, the surname is Bellis, Bellis. Also of Adolphus Augustus Bellis, beloved and esteemed, and then the end bit of that's pretty worn away, who died October the 2nd, 1846, aged 27 years. Also of Penelope, wife of the above Mr. Hugh Bellis, who departed this life the 28th of March, 18, and it's 75, aged 90 years. A very good age. And unfortunately this is pretty much a tableau with some of the graves in St Margaret's. They've been graffitied on, some have been smashed up and toppled over completely. In loving memory of Thomas Lamb, who fell asleep April the 1st, 1897, aged 66 years. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord. From henceforth years the spirit, and then it gets worn away after that. But you've got also of Mary Ann Susanna Lamb, widow of the above, who fell asleep September, and I can't work out the date because it's gone, 1916, aged 75 years at rest. And this one over here, although there's no inscription on it, this was restored a few years ago. For a few years that pyramidy pediment bit at the top there was laid down on the ground, because this one has skulls on it, memento mori, and you can see these skulls which have been replaced. It seems frightfully morbid to us nowadays to see skulls on a grave. I mean, most people wouldn't have that nowadays. You've got skulls and cherubs above, but in an era where people could and did die with frightening regularity, it reminded them to be ever mindful that death was ever present, so to live well, basically. You can see two of the skulls that bit rests on have been replaced, and that was done a few years ago. And that is a vault underneath there. in affectionate remembrance of Ellen, wife of Joseph Louth of Barking, who died September the 13th, 1869, aged 49 years. Not lost, but gone before. Also of the above named Joseph Louth, so yeah, she's wife of Joseph Louth, who died June the 28th, 1902, aged 87 years. Thy will be done. Also of Richard Louth, who died May the 5th, 1928. Heaven's morning breaks. Charles Richard Roberts of Goodmays, Essex, died July the 16th, 1840. Also in loving memory of Arthur Knapton, Knapton, who died October the 4th, 1890 something, because the last letter has gone, the last date bit has gone. And Charles Richard Roberts was aged 38 years. Also in loving memory of Margaret Elizabeth Tristram Roberts, daughter of C.R. Roberts, who died May the 8th, 1883. Oh yuck, that wasn't a leaf, it was bird poo. And all you can see on this one is just a surname of Longdon. London. London. Whether that's where he came from or just a surname, I do not know. This one, inscription, and this is pretty much completely gone, so I tend to miss those now because you tend to stand there trying to read out, and I'd rather be able to give you clear names and details. It's got a pretty impressive coat of arms on top. Taylor, 1866. The family grave of Henry and Elizabeth Taylor, in loving memory of Griffith Taylor, son of the above, who died August the 16th, 1866, aged 27 years. Also of Elizabeth Taylor, who died June the 8th, 1870, aged 54 years. Also Henry Taylor, who died April the 20th, 1873, aged 71 years. Also Frederick William Taylor, who died at Aika, Paris, South Africa, SA, South Africa, I assume that stands for. February the 11th, 1885, aged 29 years. Thy will be done. But before we walk the very short distance behind this box tomb to our next young lady, whose grave is the second oldest in the churchyard with a survivable inscription. This is the bone chute. The boiler was put down there many years ago, but in medieval to Georgian times really, it basically did exactly what it said on the tin. This is a little room under here where a boiler is now. They bricked up the part that led into the crypt. But in the old days, when a churchyard became full, they would do something called charnelling, where they would dig up old bones and they'd be put down the bone chute, taken through into the crypt, into something like an ossuary, and kept there. And it seems gorish to us, doesn't it? But it was a perfectly acceptable thing in those days, and people were quite comfortable with it, as long as those bones stayed within the domain of their parish church, ready for Judgment Day. It was a necessary evil. Now I'll take you to our next oldest one amongst these box tombs with their inscriptions long since worn away, which is what makes this young lady's grave quite remarkable, really, because where younger graves around her have lost their inscriptions, hers has lasted and stood the test of time. You can see above the skull and crossbones the memento mori with timers, the old sand timers there to remind people to be mindful of the ever-present threat of death. Here lieth buried the body of Jane Young, the daughter of Edward and Mary Young of this parish, who departed this life the 20th of January 1689, aged 16 years and 3 months. And she's the second oldest to Thomas More's grave, and like with Thomas More, I've been able to find the burial records for not only Anne but also her parents. So to end us off in this little bit of our instalment, we're going to focus on those now, and then you'll be joining me for the next part. And once again, we're back with the burial registers from St Margaret's Church in Barking. And if you look to where the arrow is, you'll see that on the 26th of January 1689 was buried daughter of Edward Young. And something I've picked up on of this era, it was quite misogynistic in a way. If you look up and down this list, you'll see wife of, daughter of. These women weren't always given their name, which I don't approve of really, but they lived in a different era which was very male orientated. Because if you look to the top of the list, you'll see John, son of. The men were given their names, and quite a few of the women weren't. I mean, one person in March is just given the surname of Griggs. So a lot depended on your social status and your sex in those days. Jane died on the 20th of January 1689 and was buried 6 days later. And once again, if you look to March, you'll see that the new year began in the middle of March. And I've done quite a bit of research into this family, because I've walked past Jane's grave many times over the years, and with the inscription being so well preserved, it's often made me wonder about her family, and herself, of course. So, I can tell you that Jane's father, Edward Young, he died in 1703 and was buried on the 20th of June 1703, so would have died just a few days before, being a hot month. And from my other research I've done, I've been able to discover that he was a master baker. So upper working class and wealthy enough to be able to afford a grave in a very prominent position next to the church, and a fine tombstone for his daughter. Jane's mother, Mary Young, she died in 1713 and was buried on the 17th of September 1713. And with Thomas More and Jane Young and all the people that we're going to cover in this tour, they're not just names on a cold stone. They were living, breathing people with thoughts and feelings very much like ourselves. Somebody's somebody, if you will. So on that note, I would like to show you a little bit of the world that they came from. What was the Barking of their era like? Up until the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the coming of the railways, Barking was a very rural place, a busy, bustling market town, but surrounded by fields and countryside, as you can see from this beautiful little painting that shows cows and open fields, and of course prominently in the centre St Margaret's Church, that's stood the test of time and stood there and seen all this change right from the medieval period to our own. And if stones could speak, I often wonder what they would say about modern barking. Would they approve, or would they scream? Barking Quay and the mill pond. This would have featured in the lives of Thomas More and Jane Young. Particularly for a young girl, it would have been quite a thing to go down to the quayside and watch the fishing boats going to and from. Barking had a great fishing industry. And if you look over to the right, you'll see St Margaret's Church tower. In the centre, next to the trees, is the mill, where the corn and grain would have been ground for the town to make the bread. And this building is the Leet House in 1615. It acted as the town's court. And I've read some descriptions that say this building was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I as an apology to Barking for the loss of its great abbey, but that is really just conjecture. But over to the right, you can see featured prominently there St Margaret's Church. And here we have the market town, within the centre the curfew tower. And St Margaret's Church in the centre, surrounded by open fields and countryside. And as was explained to us on the bell tower tour by one of the lovely bell ringers, the church tower only has clock faces on two sides, one facing the quay and one facing the town, because in those days, as you can see from this image, the other two sides face towards open countryside, and as was said, the cows don't tell the time. This is a modern construction image showing us what the Barking market of the 16th and 17th century would have looked like, going from descriptions of the era. A busy, bustling market. And there's been a market on this site since the reign of King Henry II. You can see the Leet Courthouse over to the left, and over to the right the curfew tower. And I often wonder what Thomas More and Jane would make of the modern Barking market. Would they approve, or would they disapprove? And that's just a little bit of their lives. Well, that's Jane Young, and as you can see on here, it's spelt Y-O-U-N-G-E. It's Y-O-U-N-G, as we saw in the burial register, and sadly in the register she wasn't even given her name, just the daughter of Edward Young. So join me for our next instalment.